Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Wednesday, January 3rd. This is day 89 since the October 7th attacks by Hamas on the south of Israel. I wanted to provide an update today on the Armenian quarter in the Old City of Jerusalem. Several weeks ago, Churches for Middle East Peace put out a statement saying that the very existence of Christians, certainly in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, is under threat. And in the East, in the Old City of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, which is a part of the occupied Palestinian territories, the Armenian quarter is one of the quarters of the Old City. And on December 28th, a mob of 30 masked men armed with pepper spray and various weapons entered the Armenian quarter of the Old City and tried to remove barricades to allow access for bulldozers. This report is from Christian Concern. They continued and talked about how Armenian Christian inhabitants resisted, and then the mob attacked them. According to a communication which we put out on our social media from the Armenian Patriarchate, several priests, deacons, and students of the theological seminary and other local Armenians were seriously injured in the assault. Police said that there were arrests made from both sides, but no charges were brought forward. And the Armenian Patriarchate demanded a full investigation. The situation here is that it's believed that a mob descended on the Armenian quarter in relation to a contested property deal. There was a Tel Aviv-based real estate developer called Rothman Sana Gardens, and these developers struck a deal with the Armenian Patriarchate through a priest that used to be in charge of the real estate's affairs. This was back in 2021, but the agreement was reached without the knowledge and consent of the residents of the Armenian quarter, or the Armenian institutions. The agreement gave the developers a 98-year lease on approximately 25% of the total area belonging to the Armenian community in the Old City. It would incorporate a car park, 5 residences, the conference hall of the Patriarchate. And when the agreement became known, the Armenian community protested. The priest responsible for the transaction was defrocked, and the Armenian Patriarch sent a letter to Sana Gardens and canceled the contract. But then on December 27th of 2023, the Armenian Patriarchate submitted a lawsuit to the District Court of Jerusalem to terminate the agreement. And since then, there have been escalations. So there have been Armenians who have been camping out because my understanding is that this development group is backed by settlers that want to take control of the Armenian quarter of the Old City of Jerusalem. And so a mob descended on the Armenian quarter. Protesters were speaking Hebrew, and they displayed outside the Zion Gate, accusing the Armenian Patriarch of racism, of being anti-Semitic, and they claimed that a bishop was threatening to kill the developer. In the present climate of the war in Gaza, such claims are even more provocative than usual. And so Christian Concern is requesting prayer that the Jerusalem police would conduct a full investigation about the violence, that the Armenian community would handle the situation appropriately as they seek to protect their continued presence in the Old City, and that this dispute over the shady land deal will be resolved in the courts and that justice will be done. I thought that many of you would be interested to hear that update. We certainly will keep you informed in that regard. I wanted to turn back to what's happening in terms of Gaza and Israel's war on Hamas and Israel's bombing, what we have identified as the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. There continue to be significant concerns about Palestinians being displaced and being removed outside of Gaza. I talked about this yesterday. Things have been heating up between Israel and the United States. The Israeli leaders Smotrich and Ben-Gvir have said that they are calling for Palestinians to be moved to a portion of the Sinai Peninsula. The United States the State Department heavily criticized these calls for removal. And today, the Times of Israel came out with an article and reported that this plan of Palestinian removal is not only supported by ultranationalists like Ben-Gvir, but also not only supported by ultranationalists like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, but that it's also supported by other members of the Israeli government. Now, an Israeli spokesperson denied the claims that were in this Times of Israel article. But we do know that King Abdullah of Jordan flew to Cairo, that he met with President Assisi. We can assume that that may be in part because the Israeli Defense Forces asked the Egyptian army to pull back from parts of the Gaza border near Rafah, because there are concerns that the Israeli Defense Forces will take over that entire border area, not just near Rafah, but also perhaps even on the Egyptian side. And if the Israeli Defense Forces are asking the Egyptian army to pull back, it's probably because they don't want the Egyptian army be harmed if they're going to attack that area. We don't know if the Egyptian army complied or shifted, but we do know that there's a large number of Egyptian soldiers that are along that side of the border, and that part of the idea was that President Sisi of Egypt was going to prevent a Palestinian kind of breakout from Gaza into Egypt. We also know that there are several, like tens of thousands of internally displaced people that are within an hour of the border on the Gaza side. We have heard that talks in terms of the Egyptian peace plan, that three-part proposal I talked about last week, have been put on hold after the bombing attack in Beirut that killed the senior Hamas official Saleh al-Arori. And so we heard that those conversations about a ceasefire hostage deal have been put on hold. Arab diplomats had reported that to Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, but an Israeli official expressed optimism regarding continued negotiations. And this Israeli official said Qatar has not suspended those talks. We do also know that Hezbollah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, said in Beirut that if Israel decides to go to war with Lebanon, their response would be unrestrained. A few other additional updates. There have been mixed signals about negotiations, as I just mentioned. While Arab diplomatic sources are saying they're on hold, we're hearing from Israelis. But we also know that Israeli ministers are pushing back on this whole idea of what I just reported about whether or not they're calling on Palestinians to leave Gaza. Many Israeli officials are saying that concerns about that are unfounded. Hamas's military wing responded to al-Arori's killing and said that this will only increase their determination in their struggle against Israel. The West Bank today had a day of protests and strikes and confrontations. Reports of general strikes throughout the West Bank and Ramallah, Hebron, and in Jenin have been reported. And in addition, that many streets were empty because so many people had gone on strike in response to that attack. Sirens did blare across North Israel. The Israeli Defense Forces said there were several launches from Lebanon into Israel and that Israel responded. I mentioned Nasrallah's speech talking about flagrant Israeli aggression and that Lebanon's response would be unrestrained if Israel does declare war on Lebanon. As of yet, Israel has not, at least as of this morning, Israel had not claimed al-Arori's death and that bombing as having been their own. We also know that Iran's defense minister said today that the killing of al-Arori in Lebanon would have consequences. Iran also blamed the United States for rising tensions. And the top advisor to President Biden, Amos Hochstein, on the issue of averting war between Israel and Lebanon's Hezbollah, is set to be in Israel later this week. So that will happen on the horizon. The United Nations interim force in Lebanon said that it's deeply concerned at the potential escalation with devastating consequences for people on both sides of the blue line. So for those of you who might not know, the blue line is the demarcation line dividing Lebanon from Israel and the Golan Heights, which is in between Israel and Syria. It was published by the United Nations on June 7th, 2000. for the purposes of determining whether Israel had fully withdrawn from Lebanon. The line has been described as temporary and not a formal border, but a line of withdrawal. U.S. intelligence published assessments that Islamic Jihad and Hamas had been operating in Gaza City's Al-Shifa hospital. Those reports just came out. And the U.S. State Department, I had mentioned their responses to Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, calling their statements about the removal of Palestinians inflammatory and irresponsible. After the U.S. State Department responses, France and Germany also issued similar statements. Smotrich later made an unverified claim that 70% of the Israeli public supports encouraging the humanitarian solution of Gazan voluntary immigration. So he is claiming that Israelis support the removal of Palestinians from Gaza. And then the death toll, the bombing of Gaza has still continued. And now reports are saying more than 400,000 cases of infectious diseases have been reported since October 7th. There was big news in Iran this morning. There was a bomb that went off that killed at least 103 people and 141 were wounded. This was the 4th anniversary of the killing of Qassem Soleimani, who's the head of the Revolutionary Guard's elite Quds forces. He was killed in a U.S. drone strike in Iraq. So that bombing has not been claimed. There's not been more news about that, but there is concern about how that will affect the regional stability. In addition, we've talked a lot about the Houthis and their attacks of ships that are headed to Israel in the Red Sea. The UN Security Council met today and discussed that. And they talked about how the Houthis must halt their attacks on ships in the Red Sea, saying that they threaten regional stability, global freedom of navigation, and food supplies. In addition, the U.S. believes the situation has reached an inflection point, said Chris Liu, a U.S. representative to the United Nations. These attacks pose grave implications for maritime security, international shipping and commerce, and undermine the fragile humanitarian situation in Yemen. And finally, pressure is continuing to grow towards a ceasefire in the United States. There has been a lot of news and conversation about a global day of action on January 13th, particularly calling on a march on Washington, D.C., for Gaza, calling for a ceasefire and for groups to end all violence. As you know, Churches for Middle East Peace is calling for a comprehensive ceasefire, the release of hostages, and immediate and adequate humanitarian assistance into Gaza while addressing the core